Welcome everybody to the third in our series of annual British Shintaido lectures. Really appreciate people being here, and to remind you, the idea of these lectures is really to explore different aspects of what Shintaido means and how we think that we can use it and what we can do with it in future, building on the knowledge and experience of our members who are talented people in such a wide range of fields. So tonight we have Susan Lacroix, who's going to speak to us, who's obviously a member of British Shintaido, both of Bath Shintaido in particular, Bath Bow Club. Susan is a remarkably talented, multifaceted person. She studied politics and economics at university and did her PhD in urban politics and public housing. And in the course of that, she says, that led to her marriage and to becoming an organic farmer with her husband, Laurent, and of course, building a family. The world of organics and farming led her into homeopathy, into which she's qualified, and then she became a counselor. To that, she's added training in somatic experiencing, and she's studied integral somatic psychology with Dr. Raja Selvam and children and trauma with Maggie Klein and Ale Duarte. And of course, she's been doing a lot of Shintaido and Bojitsu, and studied Anma massage with Ito Sensei, which she loves doing. So she is eminently qualified, I think, to speak to us on a subject that is interesting to me, the psychological impact of Shintaido and its role for helping people through the difficulties of life. So the subject of her talk tonight is Shintaido and trauma, an exploration. And I think she's calling it an exploration because she feels that she's going to introduce the subject, but actually everybody here, I'm sure, will have things to say about it. And I think we want to explore together and turn it into a discussion, a sharing, not just a delivery of a lecture ex cathedra. So with that, over to Susan. And I just want to begin the question, trauma or trauma? How do you say the word?
I say trauma. Okay. I always say trauma, but I'm not a linguistic authority. Well, anyway, good evening and good morning or good afternoon, whatever it is in your time zone. Thank you very much for coming. And I'm delighted and actually honoured to be asked to speak on this subject, because for me it's very meaningful, and hopefully for you it will be interesting and helpful for you. Before starting, I've got a lot of people to thank. So first of all, I'd very much like to thank all the people who've helped me to study and enjoy Shintaido. There are so many people, I can't name them all. And all the teachers that I've studied with for trauma work. And I'm really grateful to all of those for sharing with me their hard-won understanding. But my understanding is very limited. So I really hope that after having presented some of these themes, as Peter suggested, we exchange together, because I think a lot of you will know a lot more than I do about trauma and indeed Shintaido. So I hope we'll have a group kumite, an exchange together. And that will be much more enriching for all of us. So the plan is that we'll start with a kind of a warm-up or an introduction, and then we'll discuss and talk about what trauma is, when it might arise, and there'll be some explanation of the theory of it, which I kind of can't avoid. I've tried to make it as light as possible. And then we'll look at somatic experiencing in particular, which is a way of working with trauma discovered or elaborated by Dr. Peter Levine. And then we'll turn to Shintaido. So let's start. So my first question to you is, are you sitting comfortably? Or standing, or whatever your current posture is? So just let's take a moment to notice if we are feeling comfortable. And actually, what does it feel like when we feel comfortable? And then how do you know that you feel comfortable? This may seem like a rather weird question, but just play along with me. So now Peter is going to do something. So I'd like you, now you're comfortable, to please all stand up, having got comfortable. And Peter is going to demonstrate and do some ski, which is sending energy or punching, whichever you like to think of it as. So please adjust your own distance from the screen and just get yourself standing. And then he's going to do this towards us. And just notice how you feel.
Hey. 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 Hey.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. So having experienced that, please sit down again and really do get comfortable this time. And just notice how it felt when he was doing this. And now, just before we really do get comfortable, let's imagine that we have a feather duster that's attached to the end of our nose, those old-fashioned types of dusters that stick out with those feathers of different colors. And let's just imagine that let's turn our head to one side of our space. And let's imagine that we are going to very slowly and lightly dust over everything in our sight lines. And as we do so, we're going to turn our head very slowly to the other side of the room. So let's just do that and see again, what does it feel like when we do that? So just notice how that feels. And now, what is all this about? Why have I suggested these things? Well, the word trauma means wound, however it's pronounced. So pretty much all of us will have experienced something wounding in our lives, although most of us won't have been incapacitated or too deeply marked by such experiences, hopefully. We can summarize trauma as a rupture. So there'll be a before and an after. And there'll be certain characteristics in the trauma situation, such as not having enough time, not having space, not having a safe person there to help us, not having the skills to cope with the situation, maybe conflicting impulses like wanting to run away and not being able to, or wanting to fight but not being able to, maybe a sense of rage, a sense of helplessness, and there'll be some kinds of consequences. So we might struggle with boundaries. We might not be able to recognize ours or those of other people. We might not be able to make good relationships with other people and indeed with ourselves and our own body. Some people will withdraw and become depressive and hopeless, and other people might engage in compulsive risk-taking behaviors. And all of these are some ways to manage and cope with something unbearable and overwhelming. Now, in the beginning of this talk, I suggested to you to notice how things felt for you in these different circumstances. And it's that feeling sense which is existing in the body. It is not existing in the mind. That's to say, it's a lived experience. And as Bessel van der Kolk so famously has said, it's the body which keeps the score and not the mind. And if we were to evoke a traumatic experience of our own right now, it's possible that the sensations and emotions which belong to it then might arise now as they did then, because the body isn't distinguishing between now and then, and only the mind is doing that. So it's always now in the body. And that's one reason why turning the head, as we just did, can be very helpful. It's called orienting, and it can help us to come back to here and now, and to connect the mind and the body, or the head and the body, which can be interrupted by trauma. The neck can literally be the bridge between the two, between the head and the body. And there's a very useful exercise for people who have too much energy in the head and feel that they can't have any connection with the body. It's very simple. You're putting one hand on the forehead and the other hand on the back of the head around the occipital ridge, with the fingers dropping down into the neck, and sometimes just holding like this, as if you were able to hold your brain and cradle it, can be really settling for people, for some people. So in somatic experiencing, we're working what's called bottom up. That's to say, we're working mainly with the body, not exclusively. Whereas in cognitive therapies, such as CBT, where people do work, well, pretty much mostly with the mind and with talking. And that distinction is really important. So there are very good reasons to start with the body. And we'll see here in a diagram which shows the three brains. You can see here there are three brains. And we can see that we have the neocortex. This is the most sophisticated. It's the brain which can reason, can think logically, can order. And I think only humans have that brain. But like all mammals, we also have two more primitive brains. So we have the reptilian, which is concerned with instinct, metabolism, survival. And we have the limbic, which is concerned with fight and flight, emotion, feeling, and encompasses the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the release of stress hormones in the body. And in trauma, the connection between these brains is often fractured. And the neocortex can become inaccessible. So people feel they literally can't think straight. It's the primitive brains which are constantly scanning and selecting information from our environment, and they're informing us about safety. They also work far more quickly than the neocortex. So for example, when you go to a public place, where do you sit? For example, do you habitually sit with your back against the wall, or do you sit where you can see the door? You might not actually notice that you do that, or that you do it habitually. In words, it might be, I don't feel safe if I think someone's coming from behind me, or I only feel safe if I know I can get out quickly. So that would be the feeling that we could be having. And what about response to a perceived actual threat? So let's say we're outside going for a walk, and all of a sudden we notice something really odd over there. There's a strange sound, there's a strange sight. We don't know quite what it is. So there'll be a sense of startling alert in our body system. And then we'll look what's called defensive orienting to check. Is that safe? Is it not safe? What actually is it? Let's say it's fine, it's safe. So let me just keep going. But let's say it isn't fine and we feel there's something wrong and we look more closely. And let's say, this is a bit fantastical, but let's say it's a lion. So naturally we'd feel frightened. And most likely by ourselves, we're not expecting to fend off a lion. So we would probably want to mobilize to run away. So we'll see in a little bit what happens in the sympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that's responsible for mobilizing. But let's say we were going to run away. All the energy is mobilized in our body, muscles and joints, ready to run. And here we can see a picture. In this situation, this person looks like he's going to fight, but it would be the same if actually he was going to run away. So we can see that the body systems, all these body systems are affected. The breathing, the heart, the blood pressure, everything there is going to be affected so that we've got the energy we need to run. And if we successfully run away, despite our terror, we might shake a bit to discharge that energy, and then we might talk to some people about our experience, and those things will help us to settle in our nervous system. And probably there wouldn't then, if that was well done, be any remnant of trauma. And also, we might have recourse to the thing that we as mammals would most likely do, which is call other people. So we might scream and hope someone else would come and help us. And all together, we might all fend off the lion. And the same thing would happen. We might all shake a bit and move around to get rid of our energy. And we might talk about it, and then we would settle. But what would happen if we looked at the lion, we were overcome with terror, and we simply couldn't move at all? We froze, in fact. The body's activated, the muscles and the joints are all ready to do something, but we can't move. And that state is called tonic immobility. And it's really frightening because you can't do anything, and yet you're impelled to do something. So in that state, we can't discharge the activation. We're pulled one way to do something, and another way to not do something. And that's a state that people can stay in for really a long time, well after the incident, for years even. And some people live in that state quite habitually. They're always sort of on or off, because no one's body can tolerate that degree of activation over a long time. So that is a very difficult state to live in. And people can feel quite disconnected. They can feel that their body is tense and braced with this kind of bound energy. And because they can't discharge it, it can come out in a very unexpected way. They might act out very inappropriately. They might just have a state of collapse, like an elastic that snaps, just because they can't maintain that degree of activation. So in all this drama, what we're seeing is the action of the autonomic nervous system, which is a branch of the general nervous system. And as you'd expect, it's not under our conscious control, as the name tells us. And we can see there, in the autonomic nervous system, it has two branches. And we have the sympathetic nervous system, that's on the one side, and the parasympathetic nervous system on the other side. So when we become activated, it's the sympathetic nervous system that's at work. It's I can, it's alert, awake, and so on. I think it's very interesting because although the autonomic nervous system is supposedly not under our conscious control, I have a bit of a question. I really wonder whether the Buddha masters, the martial art masters, have actually found a way of using it so that they are truly responding to it, whereas most of us are reacting to it and controlled by it. And I also wonder if that's the reason why we have that saying that a real master wouldn't be in the place where there was a fight anyhow, or they wouldn't get into a fight, because they've learned to read and receive that information and take action. I don't know about that. Anyway, the autonomic nervous system has these two branches, and they're supposed to be like yin and yang. They're supposed to be balancing each other all the time. We're not supposed to be stuck in either the one or the other, but we're supposed to respond appropriately. Neither of them is better than the other. We need both of them. So as I said, the sympathetic nervous system is the awake and the alert part, which is moving towards and moving away from. And the parasympathetic nervous system ideally enables us to have rest, renewal, restoration, relaxation, to be open, to be curious, and all these things. And here are some situations where we might not be able to let go of these highly activated states, or by contrast, the flaccid and depressive ones. So in acute trauma, such as accidents, surgery, or natural disasters, where there's no time to enact the self-protective responses, they may stay in the body overtly or hidden for years. Then in developmental trauma, for example, a child is living in a very volatile household with a parent who's, say, alcoholic or bipolar. And there are no rules to keep safe. You just don't know what kind of mood this parent's going to be in, and you don't know when something is going to happen to you. So the child is always going to be on the lookout to try to read the signs. They're going to be hypervigilant. So a child like this is not going to learn how to feel safe very easily. They're going to be looking for danger, what we call orienting for danger. And then even in utero, a baby can be exposed to trauma because the mother might have a trauma and the stress hormones will cross the placenta. And in utero, and indeed after birth, the baby can only do a few things to get away from an unpleasant stimuli. So for example, the baby can turn its head away, which we see sometimes in ultrasounds and amniocentesis. It can sleep, close its eyes, or it can tense the muscles of the gut. And some people think that's one reason why certain people are predisposed to irritable bowel syndrome in later life. In any case, the baby might be then in a state which is called global high intensity activation. And they can be born in that state of constantly on. So they're always going to be highly reactive. And it's going to be very hard for someone like this to find how to feel safe and to find how to really relax. So they could always be in a state of anxiety and looking how to pin that anxiety onto something outside. So for example, they see a black dog and they say, that's why I feel so anxious. It's because of that dog. But of course, the anxiety was already there. It's nothing to do with the dog. For example, if we lived in a war zone and we went outside, we might quite naturally be looking for snipers or taking care not to be in the line of a bomb. But most of us are not living in that kind of environment. So we're not expecting that kind of danger. We're oriented to safety. In that kind of a heightened state, people really can't distinguish between what is a serious threat and what isn't. So, for example, I worked with a war veteran, and any time he heard a loud noise, it could be children playing, something quite innocuous, he would panic and get extremely angry because he would immediately be reminded of being in Afghanistan and the bombs there because he served in that place. There's also intergenerational trauma. And one could expect that people born to parents in, let's say, war-torn Syria or Ukraine now might well have that kind of trauma susceptibility. And in fact, people who are descendants of Holocaust survivors, even to this day, have got that kind of traumatic background, and it can still influence them even now. So now let's look at the parasympathetic nervous system. And here we can see a part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the vagal nerve system. There are several in the polyvagal nerve system, two different nerves. And you can see here, it's called the vagus nerve system because it traverses the body, it wanders around the body. So we can see how important it is. So there are two branches of this polyvagal system, the ventral vagal system, and the dorsal vagal system. So let's start with the ventral vagal system. So in order to get a feeling of what that's like, imagine you're having a delicious meal with your friends and family. It's good company, it's good food, it's good wine if you drink it. It's just a lovely evening or time, and you're feeling expansive and open. That's an image of social connection and relaxation. That would be a typical example of the ventral vagal system. Now imagine that you're with quite the opposite, people who are hostile, anyhow not your friends. And the food isn't going to taste so good. In fact, you may feel so anxious that, like a few clients have told me, you actually can't eat in front of those people, or you can only eat standing up because you're afraid. And you feel rather like a prey animal, having to be on the lookout all the time. The ventral vagal system develops in infancy, and it depends very much on how the caregivers that we have model self-soothing and co-regulation, how they show us how to manage our states of distress. We also learn how to read the faces of other people to gauge safety and develop trust. And that is one reason why the mask wearing of recent years has been so disastrous for very small children, because it's very hard to learn those signs if you can't see them in the people around you. So a useful way to animate the ventral vagal system is this. Let's imagine that we're in San Francisco, where I know it's factually correct to say there's a lot of fog. it may not be so correct to say, so I'm putting poetic license here, that the way into the harbor is rocky and full of obstacles, but let's imagine it is. And let's imagine that we are on the boat and we have to get into the harbor and we can't find our way. So we're going to be the foghorn that's guiding us into the harbor. And very simply, we just inhale, and as we exhale, we make the sound vu. So let's do that together twice. And it doesn't matter if the exhalation is long or short or whatever, that's really beside the point. So let's just do it and see what happens, see how we feel. And then one more time. So you may have noticed that there's a kind of resonance in the ventral area of your body, the abdomen, and there's a kind of animation of the viscera. And when we're stuck in the other aspect of the polyvagal system, the dorsal vagal aspect of the polyvagal system, if we see that slide again, we can see those two branches of the parasympathetic system. So you can see here that there are the two branches. So the dorsal vagal system is very different. It doesn't have that sense of connection and social engagement. We're in a state of partial freeze. It's about, I can't, we feel passive. The sympathetic nervous system activation is inhibited. It's like there's a brake being put on there. And if that's not enough, then we can have a total shutdown situation. It's like we check out and we play dead. It's meant for extreme life-threatening situations. So you have this with a prey animal. So when a prey animal is being chased by a predator, if it can't escape, it may lie down and appear to be dead. Many predators won't eat a carcass, so that's quite an effective strategy. And if the predator then goes off to look for a better meal, the prey animal will eventually check that it's okay. It will get up, it will shake and discharge its activated energy, and then it will run away. If, however, the predator is going to eat it, because it's in this shutdown state, this playing dead state, it won't feel the same degree of terror and pain that it would have done because of the numbness. So if it is going to be eaten, it won't be such a horrible experience for it at the end of its life. So people do this too, and it's an extreme hypo state. We're really not meant to stay in it, but a lot of people do. For example, one client who was abused in childhood used to try not to breathe and not to move so that somehow the abuser wouldn't come into the room. It's that kind of a situation. And some people live in a so-called false window of tolerance, whereby they constrict their experience of everything, body and emotions, to a sort of narrow window, because they feel that if they would expand that narrow window at all, they might actually die. They would feel completely overwhelmed. So, for example, if they had a rapid heartbeat, which would be normal after any kind of exertion, the very symptom of the rapid heartbeat would cause them to go into a state of panic. And then that fear would spiral into generalized panic. We can see it with the help of this Hoberman sphere here. These kinds of situations are when people tense to keep the window closed. So instead of expanding naturally, like when we're breathing, we have expansion and contraction and so forth. These people tend to keep a state of generalized constriction like this. This can refer to the physical body. And actually, in a state of activation like that, when you think about all the energy that you need to keep everything constricted, you can actually create a lot of inflammation on a chronic basis. It's very interesting. You can affect the gut, so assimilation can be compromised, and that can affect serotonin, T cells, immune function, even memory and the IQ, interestingly. And obviously, if breathing is that constricted, you're not going to get much oxygenation and you're likely to get fatigue. But there's also constriction of the emotions. And Dr. Rajaselvam has done a lot of work in this area, which has been really helpful to add to the somatic experiencing work. And he's suggesting that when people feel very strong emotions like grief and anger, they feel that they'll be annihilated or they'll fragment. And people do actually say this. He also gave the example of Vipassana students who are very, very good at tracking the felt sense in the body, but very, very bad often at being in touch with their emotions. And as it so happened, the very day after hearing about this at a lecture, I had a new client who was actually a senior Vipassana student, and he was really good at tracking his body and simply couldn't be in touch with his emotions at all. So he lived in a state of tremendous constriction. So how would we work with somatic experiencing? Let's just look at some methods we might be using. First of all, we're going to start with safety. This is the be all and end all, really. The first thing is to establish what safety feels like and what resources we might have to feel safe and to track what that feels like in the body. So the felt sense of safety. This is the way that classical SE practice tends to start. Once we have that, then we can go a little bit towards the edge of what is the trauma. But like Ito Sensei says, we would only go to the beginning of the trauma. We don't go further than that. And then we would go pendulating between them. So we'd go from safety to and then go back to safety. Gradually, we develop tolerance for and can enlarge. And over time, that pendulum swings more and more, and we can go right into the heart of the trauma. But we are always extremely careful about pacing that. Then we can renegotiate and we can successfully accomplish or complete thwarted and failed states of activation. So for example, if we wanted to push someone or something away and we couldn't do it then, perhaps we were a child, we can do it now, slowly, piece by piece. And as we do it, we notice and bring in any kinds of associations that arise with that action. And that can be immensely powerful. Those kinds of actions can have stayed in our body for years. We also can disconnect parts of ourselves, and we can work to reconnect those parts. So an example is someone whom I'm working with who has a brain injury after an accident. And so we asked together if his body knew that he'd survived. That might seem like a strange question, but actually his mind did know, but his body was stuck in then. His body hadn't fully realized that he had actually survived. And it made a great difference when his body was able to come back to now and realize that fact. If you're interested in that aspect of trauma, have a look at the work of Dr. Janice Hadlock. There'll be a reference in the chat section. She's an American acupuncturist who I think is in Santa Cruz. And she's worked a lot with what she calls the deleted, traumatized parts of the body and stuck in pause mode. Her work is really interesting. And we're also working to recreate or create boundaries, which might have been ruptured. Lack of containment in early life can be part of our trauma experience. And one practitioner developed a fantastically good exercise with the wall to give feedback. This was very useful in lockdown when most of us were working remotely. And so putting your hands against the wall in a certain way can give you the feeling of containment. And the trouble comes when you move your hands away from the wall. All sorts of emotions and states of energy can rise up. It's really interesting how such a simple exercise can be so powerful. We might use what's called technically SIBAM. This is sensation and tracking, imagery, behavior, affect, and meaning making. All of those could be ways to work with trauma. And they're all very effective, depending on the nature of the person and how they like to work best. We're also going to be working on interoception, which is our ability to notice our own internal state. So we can recognize what we need and work out how we can try to get it. We're also working on exteroception, which is how we notice our external environment via the sensory system. In stress, we can have really distorted sensory impressions. For example, a client recently said that they can't hear and therefore they can't really learn from their adult education instructor. And the reason for that is that they grew up in a household where a very abusive parent would be shouting and yelling abuse all the time. So the person was always trying to block it out. And that affected their schooling, and it still persists to this day. We might use appropriate touch, and I find this absolutely fascinating. By holding, let's say, the kidney area of the body, something can release in the order itself without the therapist trying to do anything at all. It's just probably the sense of containment. Well, I don't actually know what it is. We might also work on the 7 diaphragms of the body. Most of us are used to the fact that there's only one diaphragm, which is the respiratory one, but actually 7 have been identified. And it's really interesting because if you work with 1 or 2, you get a chain reaction throughout all of them. So there's one at the head and there's one at the on the soles of the feet. So they go throughout the body. Of course, grounding is really important as well. We know that anxiety and strong emotion causes energy to rise up the body, and we can feel completely disconnected with our lower body. So there can be various means to work with that. We might suggest having a tantrum like a 2-year-old, where we're shaking our limbs and stamping. That can be really effective. There are lots of things from Qigong. We might also use things like weighted blankets and balance boards and so forth. Imagery can be really useful too, because sometimes people can't manage to make connection with the ground. But if you have a good imagery about the earth and what's growing in the earth and stuff like that, the energy can quite naturally go down the body without the person having to make effort to try to force some connection with the ground. Personally, I almost never use breathing specifically because many people panic when they realize they can't control their breathing. And I always feel that breathing comes by itself when the system quietens itself. Other people do use breathing. Of course, the relationship between the client and the therapist is itself reparative. Perhaps the person didn't have that kind of co-regulation with their caregivers early on in life. So the relationship itself can be, of course, very, very helpful. In situations of abuse or when someone didn't fight back, there can be an awful lot of stigma and there can be shame as well as helplessness. And actually, the physiology of shame is very similar to the physiology of trauma. So we would work with that as well. So after this lightning overview of what trauma might be, let's now turn to Shintaido. And if I was writing a book here, writing a chapter, I would put, people sometimes write little words under the chapter heading before the body of the chapter. And if I was writing that, I would write Bokkyo-i, which means looking homewards, or maybe it would stretch to coming homewards, because in trauma, people very often don't know what that is. They aren't at home in themselves. They aren't at home with the people around them. They aren't at home in the world, and they may even not feel at home in the universe. And in Shintaido, we may learn ways to feel at home in all of those areas. So whatever Shintaido is, it most definitely and clearly is not therapy. It's not meant for that. So we aren't looking for therapy, but because we all come to it with our own patterns of constriction and distortions, we can find a lot of help in it without having to tell our story or talk about what happened to us. So in traditional somatic experiencing style, let's start with safety in Shintaido, because with it, we can dare to explore. So one means to feel safe in Shintaido is the use of space. So when we go to the practice place or the dojo, we go into a special space, and that's marked by the fact that we bow when we arrive in it to show that we're entering a special space and it's a new moment. So that in itself is a helpful reminder. There's also dojo care, which is cleaning the space to make it fit for practice. And when we do that, it's very interesting because our body gets to know the dimensions of the space. We see where the exits are, and that can help us to feel safe as well. And of course, feeling safe in the space and knowing where we are, which can be quite difficult for us if we've had trauma, is really important if we're going to practice with other people, and especially if we're going to be using weapons. There's also learning to be safe in relation to other people in the group. So we study Ma, the space between ourselves and others, particularly a partner. And we have to learn how to feel whether the space is too far, and if it is, we won't feel connected, or whether it's too near, and then we actually aren't going to be physically safe. Another important aspect of Shintaido is the structure of the class or our practice. So the class is called Keiko, a practice. It could be a practice at home. And there's also kata, which is the word indicating a set sequence of movements. And because these are so structured, they provide a sense of containment. So usually when we go to a class, or even if we're doing our own practice, we start with some kind of a warming up. In fact, we might start with grounding. Very likely we'll have grounding and warming up exercises. And then usually we will stand in a circle and we'll have a quiet moment, and we're invited to literally meditate now, mokso. And then after that, we'll bow. So there's this moment of quiet collection after the activity of the warming up. Then we'll be having moments of activation when we're doing movements. But we'll also be watching what we have to do and learning perhaps new movements. So there'll be a rhythm. There'll be a rhythm of activation, and there'll be a rhythm of quietening and relaxation as well. And that can really help us, because the class teacher or the Garesha can therefore contain those people who are arriving in a state of dysregulation. Perhaps people are full of aggressive energy and sort of, this kind of tense energy, or perhaps they're very floppy. So by managing that process and how much activation there is and how much quietening there is, we can all be brought into a kind of common state. In fact, the breathing of the group can be managed as well. And even standing in a circle can be really supportive, because everybody, whoever and whatever we are, has a place in that circle. And in trauma, we can feel that we don't belong, we're an outsider, but we can all be accepted in that circle. So that also provides a sense of containment. And as in trauma, energy often shrinks or seems to shrink into the midline of the body and the spine. All those opening and extensive movements that we have in warm-up as well, like cleansing sick energy, we have this kind of opening movement. It's really helpful. Even taking off a jersey when we have this stretching out movement, all these movements can help to release the energy and to flow outwards if it's been constricted. We have also kicking using the legs with vigor, and we have voice, kiai. So we're using energy with focus, power and vigor, and it's free of inhibition. That can give us a real sense of empowerment, especially if we feel rather helpless and weak. Of course, the role of the Garesha, the person taking the practice, is really important. Besides creating the right rhythm for the group of people that day, he or she has to create and ensure safety, especially if we're using weapons like staff or sword. And they have to check that the partners in practice and kumite are well matched. There isn't some kind of overt aggression. But also, if someone arrives in a kind of depressive state, the Garesha has to create a core group which can carry the keiko, and then continue to invite the outsider to join the group. They have to assess, is that person wanting to watch only for some reason, or do they need to be received and helped to be able to participate? And all of that can be done without talking. It's a sense of being accompanied and supported, like a kind of co-regulation. Then we have the more senior practitioners, the senpai, and these act as guides or mentors, and they can really help the less experienced people to learn with less pressure, because learning can be very charged. And we're often told to go at the pace of the slowest member of the class, and that all takes off some of that pressure. And it helps people not to have that feeling that they're going to freeze or that they're incompetent, which can also be consequences of trauma. And just as we are gathered into the circle, we also have the opportunity to gather the dissociated parts of ourselves. For example, in Toyotsu Kihon, the practice of the essential movements, my understanding is that that means bringing together mind, body, and spirit. And in doing those basic movements, rather like scales in music, we have the chance to do that. They're clear, they're strong, and they're purposeful. Also, we can reorient ourselves because someone who has a passive, habitually collapsed body can find that sense of verticality in Tenshijin, when we have that idea of heaven above, earth below, and people in the middle. So that vertical axis itself can be very helpful for us. And in Keiko, we can take some risks we might not take in life. For example, we're told, it doesn't matter, you're going to die anyhow, or one life, one chance. And we know it's a manner of speaking, but we also know at some level that is very deeply true. We also can practice, we do practice receiving an attack or a ski like we did, which Peter showed us before, from behind. And at first we might be reacting from a sort of hypervigilance. Oh, I know he's coming, I can hear the squeak of his shoe or something like this. And then it looks as if we've heard it and we've reacted, and we've caught it. But actually, this is a million miles away from the kind of relaxed emptiness with which we might be able to actually respond and not react to what's coming. In other words, instead of defensive orienting, we can engage in exploratory orienting. So we're looking around, we're curious, we're not looking for danger. And even when being attacked by several people at once, for example, at first there could be a sort of freeze, panic, or there might be too much reaction. And then one day, maybe we learn to let go if just for a moment, and then we can experience a sense of freedom. And then it's like entering into a kind of river of shared movement. There's no attacker, there's no defender. Everybody is just together in that river. And then the other people have the main strategy of defense, of running away. So they need to practice going into danger, irimi, which often turns out to be the safest place. Many people also are very afraid to express anything like direct aggression. So aiming a wooden staff or sword directly at someone can seem quite terrifying to them. It can take quite a long time to realize that a direct intentional cut or movement is actually much safer and is even beneficial for the person receiving it. The kiai, the sound that we add, the voice, can add to the feeling of energy and power as well. And all of that may help us to drop some kind of delusions we have about ourselves as people who couldn't possibly be that powerful, who can't express this kind of energy. We're kind of nice, quiet, gentle people. And at a risk of offending and generalizing, I think that's often the case for women in certain cultures and a certain age. It could be very important for people who have the feeling that they're a victim of someone, like, let's say, an unjust parent. They feel that this parent has wrecked their lives, and that if it wasn't for that parent, they would be completely different, and that their personal nature is sweet, kind, placid, and all the rest of it. And it's the parent who has all these strong, harsh emotions and feelings. And in Keiko, we often we can be in front of our own negative or dark side, and it can actually be completely shattering. And it can be even more shattering for someone who feels that by expressing that, they're going to be like a parent, let's say, who was abusive or very angry. It can be extremely hard to accept that. But because we're in a group, the group can help to contain that kind of situation. Some people have to learn the value of stepping back. Those people might find it very hard to receive, to surrender, and they want to go forward and challenge too much or to control. In fact, to be in control is often apparently much safer. we have an outwardly similar activity in trauma work, very similar to Renki. It's called Infinity Handshake, and it consists of two people. They cross their arms like this. I'll stand up to show it a little bit better. And they hold each other's hands, and they bend their knees. And then the idea is that you are going to push and pull, and push and pull. And then you have to get a sense of trust in the other person, and that you have to become sensitive and listen to what they're doing. Of course, doing this with adults, as I did at a fantastic play shop, we could talk to each other and so on, but nearly everybody found that extremely difficult and found it very hard to trust in the other person. In seaweed exercise, in Wakame, we have, and in Renki too, we have a similar situation where we have to listen to the other person and to learn to receive and accept whatever is coming our way. And for some people, that is really incredibly difficult because of the feeling of always needing to be in control. So let's now ask, we're now going to ask Ulla Sensei, who's very kindly going to show us how to practice a partner exercise from Tenshin Goso Kumite. And the purpose of it is to experience letting go and accepting to receive what we call a cut. So here is Ulla Sensei, and she is going to demonstrate to us, and we will be able to practice with her. Thank you.
Anyway, thank you very much. I'm in a small space, so I can't open quite as much as I'd like to. But for anyone who knows Shintaido, we're going to be doing A and E, receiving. And for anyone who doesn't know Shintaido, then please bear with me as I explain what we're going to do. So you see, I have my hands here. Usually they'd be a little bit further down, but I invite you to take hold of my wrists. Imagine that you're grasping my wrists and just feel the shape and the bones inside and how warm my skin is. And I'm just going to lower those in, and you will lower with me. We're going to become very quiet and still together. And then I'm going to raise up and open and lift you with me as I raise up into the sky. I'm going to look up to the sky and then twist my hands together. So I'm twisting you up as well into my space. So we're very close. And as I untwist, I'm going to move my hands forward so that you have to receive as I'm coming into your space. So I'm stepping into your space and cutting into your center. And then from there, we're just going to move our hands back down again into a quiet space and close our eyes together. And then open, and let's bow.
Thank you very much, Ulla Sensei. So the purpose of that is, it's really rather hard to find that on Zoom, but the purpose of that is to experience what it means to open. And when we're really constricted, like we could see with this Hoberman sphere, to open is incredibly hard. And to have that feeling of someone entering into your space and opening when you're braced and armored is going to be extremely challenging. So Shintaido can really help us with that. There's also the application of what Ale Duarte has called cycles. And this is helping to regulate people in general, and it's very helpful when people are overactivated, and it also brings up the energy when people are too hypo, let's just say. So overactive people often can't decide what they want to do. They choose, they want to do a bit of this, oh no, I'm going to do that, oh no, wait a minute, that one, but they never actually get to choose and to complete because they can't sort of bring something together and focus. The other group of people might be afraid to show themselves and to actually engage in the action that's suggested. So these 5 phases, the 5 phases of these cycles, which I very quickly explain as time's passing, are readiness and pre-readiness, deciding what to do and how you're going to do it. Then we have action. Then we have interaction with the task or the materials or the other people. Then we have integration, and then we have rest. And in Keiko, we see all of these cycles all the time, and we see little cycles within the big cycle. So, you know, the big cycle could be getting ready at home. The readiness could be getting ready and then going to the practice place. And then there's another readiness, which is warming up. And then we have the actual action of the Keiko and the interaction with the other people. And then we stand in the circle and we integrate what we've learned. And then we go home and rest. So that would be one type of large cycle. And then even at the beginning of a kata, we have time to prepare. So we bow and then we stand until we feel ready. And we have the instructions, komaete, prepare, yoi, get ready. And then we have hajime, start. So each of those phases is very carefully given to us to prepare. And that really helps us to be able to engage in the action. And at the end, we then stand and gather ourselves, and then we bow. And then we're told, you know, yasune, relax, you can finish. So that kind of managing of the time of the action is really helpful for us. So we have some sympathetic activation, in other words, and then some parasympathetic calming at the end or at moments during the Keiko. Every one of us will find one of those phases harder than others. And it's really interesting to notice which is the phase that we struggle with the most. So the question of boundaries, establishing and recognizing them, is inherent in Shintaido practice. We have very close physical contact in Shintaido as well. Some people might find that disquieting and challenging, and presumably we all need to be sensitive to that. Especially the Goretia has to be very careful of that. There's also another aspect which is of power, especially that of the teacher, the Goretia. But I don't really want to dwell on that because that's not specific to Shintaido. However, everything has a dark side, so there must be one in Shintaido, and perhaps that's where it lies. But it's really a matter of governance, and I'm sure there are appropriate procedures if there are abuses or anything like that. That brings us to vulnerability and shame. We have to learn, so we're bound to be making mistakes. And it takes a long time for us to see that, as Minagawa Sensei would say, nothing wrong in Shintaido. It's not just a comforting phrase, in my opinion. I think it has a deep meaning. Also, we may become emotional, and there's absolutely no way to hide it, or in fact, to hide anything about ourselves in movement, because we're really like an open book to anyone who's able to read it. After a lifetime of trying to shrink so as not to be seen, or of trying to expand to look really big, we're now going to be challenged to dare to be seen. And that can be very, very demanding. There's another aspect relevant to trauma and Keiko. There's a fourth, lesser known protective strategy, another F besides fight, flight, and freeze, and that's called fawn. And it doesn't mean a little deer, but it means to court favor. In Keiko, we are called upon to be authentic. So fawning is really superfluous. And it can be truly liberating for people to experience that, when for years they might have been adopting that fawn tactic to keep safe from abusers and to hide in relationship. We're taught in Shintaido, don't compromise. That can be very hard to find. But in Keiko, we also learn that we have value as a member of the group and not for what we do. I'd like to mention briefly Taimyo, that great mystery or inexhaustible mystery, and a view of it which I've come to, I think, from integrating the careful hints of the many teachers. In the first part, we have relationship to ourselves, finding where our own center of gravity is, grounding, developing our will and our power, and learning not to be afraid of it. Then in the second part, we have interaction with others and with the world. Finally, we have interaction with the universe, with everything, and then again with ourselves. I think this is really relevant to trauma work. First, we have to work on ourselves, as just described, but that's not enough because we live in the world with our fellows. And finally, we have the chance to find our true place in the world and universe, if that's not too grandiose a way of putting it. Even looking at some of the names and the postures of the 10-point meditation in Taimyo Part 3, we see suggestions of a world of life, movement, connection, and freedom. For example, shining our light, a gesture of welcoming when the hands are just out from our sides, palms facing forward, which Ito Sensei has said is a gesture of welcoming. To be truly open to others and the world when one's lived through trauma is a really big thing. Then we have Bokyoi, looking homewards. In trauma, we may not know where that is. And at last we have Odachi Zanshin, the big or the great posture, standing in our true place, a position of strength, standing as ourselves. We can practice that at home and explore it at our own speed. We can refine it and work on it like we do with a piece of clay. What a fantastic gift that is. There's another way in which Shintaido can be so helpful for people who've had trauma in their lives. When we're running Eiko, let's say, or walking it or interacting with others, we can have a feeling of hopefulness and joy, happiness. That's like when we were children, if we were lucky. That feeling is so often lost as we go through life. And Shintaido can help us to experience, again, playfulness. Of course, Shintaido is deeply serious, but we don't have to be pious about it, and we don't have to go into efforting mode to find that. I think that's really all that I want to say. Thank you very much.
So, Susan, thank you so much for such a detailed, rich, and well-rounded presentation of the subject of what trauma is, the different types, the effect on the body, the ways in which that you can work with somebody who is a trauma sufferer to help them deal with it. And then this wonderful section at the end talking about different aspects of Shintaido and the many things we have within Shintaido that are just sound to me like wonderful resources, many of which I've barely thought about, but just taken for granted. And for me, you've explained why in so many ways, going to Keiko just feels like the right thing to do. So for me, thank you very much. Let me pass over to anybody else. If you have any comments or questions or anything you'd like to say, please keep it relatively brief, please. Thank you very much. Tomi, would you like to?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much, Susan. It was so clear and so helpful. I just wanted to mention that I've signed up to lead a week-long workshop. It's about almost 3 hours a day. And the title is Gentle Movement for Traumatic Times. And I designed it, it's at a conference, and I designed it for a group of people, a small group that I know who've experienced a lot of trauma and also physical ailments. And I've been thinking about this. I am not a trauma specialist. I'm a Shintaido instructor, and I'm a professional facilitator, but I wanted to tell you how helpful this backdrop is to have when I think about everything from the structure that you describe, clearly describing the structure as it relates to trauma, and the activation versus rest and integration. I'm so grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be interested to know what you come up with. like to see it.
Anybody else?
What would you be looking for in the students to know when they are ready to try Eiko?
That's a really great question. Do other people, what do other people, have other people had experience of this? What do other people think about that?
It's really interesting because as an instructor, as a beginning Shintaido student myself, It was just something that we did, and often we started and we couldn't produce a voice, or we couldn't run. In my case, I wasn't able to run. I was behind the pack. I was always the last. And at some moment when the group, it was actually the group support, as Susan mentioned, that helped me. There were people encouraging me to keep coming, that I found I was able to stretch my legs and fly. It was like a whole, and ACO was transformed. And I've seen in my own teaching that it takes some time for students to be able to express their voice. I don't know whether, I don't think we can be aware of where people are at. I think it's offered to them and they try it, and they choose to work on it or not. And I know that in my own experience as well, I have lost a whole group of people after doing ACO as well. You know, it's too much for some people and they think it's too crazy and they don't come back. But I'm not sure that answers your question, but I just wanted to share my experience. So thanks.
I suppose, you know, I feel like because the group's there, I think like Ulla suggested, that the group itself helps you. And there's always going to be things that, you know, you might struggle with, someone might struggle with. And I think that's where the Gratia comes in. If the Gratia notices that, the Gratia will help that person to include them. So I guess that's how that's how you would manage it. How they would know that, I think it's a question of them knowing their student, hopefully. But you know, you couldn't not do it because the whole class wants to do it except for one person. So you'd have to find a way of managing.
Jumping in after Ulla's comment about ACO, I could say that, I don't know, 50 years ago, the very first Keiko in England, the very first Keiko I went to, the very first thing we did was ACO, and I had come to Shintaido quite traumatized, and the very first ACO that we did changed my life. It grabbed me, it released so much, shouting, running like a child, as Susan said, the childlike movement that we'd like to find again. It changed my life. So I don't think necessarily that it's not, I don't think you need to think too much about how gently to introduce it, because sometimes it can be the most exhilarating and wonderful experience.
For me, it seems that we've all seen and probably felt the transformation that Shintaido brings to ourselves and our beings, and seeing it happening in other people and releasing the movement and becoming happier in so many different ways. But I'm very interested in this question. Susan said, I think firmly, Shintaido is not a therapy, and Heather said she's using it therapeutically. And I'm not sure whether those two things are in conflict with each other, or whether the two words, I'm not quite exactly sure about the relationship between the therapy and therapeutic. We've seen the transformation happen, we felt it happen, and yet we're not managing that. We're providing the opportunity in our classes for our students, but we are not taking responsibility. Is it something like that?
Well, I think so, because you know, not all instructors have trained in therapy, let's say. And can't be expected to provide individual therapeutic sessions. On the other hand, I suppose an instructor, certainly the senior instructors, I've seen senior instructors take on students with everything that they're bringing. So there is an element of therapeutic relationship, but it isn't sort of overt, I guess. And I suppose really what can happen is exactly the same as with, say, shiatsu or any body work, where someone suddenly discovers things that need to be worked on in their psyche, and very likely they'll then go and get some kind of proper therapy. And probably if that happens in Shintaido, a person feels moved to go and get proper therapy and not expect the group to provide that kind of therapy, because it's not the place in the class. That's what I was meaning. Whereas I don't know about Heather, but in my practice, I might well use images or movements from Shintaido if they seem appropriate, or from Qigong, because they're so helpful. But they're not the same thing, is what I mean. And other people may have different experiences of that. I suppose that's part of the problem. You know, you bow and you go into a new space, but unfortunately you take your old self with you, don't you? It's not like you can leave yourself at the door. You can't help it. So yeah, I guess that's true. But it's just that I think one has to be quite clear that, you know, there's often talking at the beginning of a keiko, and one has to be quite clear that, you know, we're there to practice Shintaido, not to engage in therapy. That, you know, they're kind of different activities, but obviously there'll be overlap.
I just want to say, comment, Susan, your description of Shintaido, particularly around how we create that safe space, that safe environment, the attention to clarity and safety as we're going in the dojo, when creating that preparation before we go in, that very, very clear, very high level understanding of it is, I just want to very much compliment you on how clear that was and how amazing your awareness and perspective on that is. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say, for me, what happens after a good Shintaido class is kind of the way people feel about one another. So it usually, if it's a good class and people are open and they've used their bodies and they've used their voices and nobody's had a terribly traumatic time in the class, usually by the end of it, I would feel that people felt very warm and open to one another. And I don't think that always happens in other practices. And I was doing some writing recently where I was looking into the idea of trauma and trauma getting lodged in your body, and how does that get dealt with. And in the one person I read about was this guy Vander Kolk. You probably know who he is, where he talked, at first it was yoga that was what he used. But actually, I think in Shintaido, because we use our voices, because we're touching, because we're opening and receiving and following and leading and all of that, it kind of has a way to make you feel the goodness of your body, which can hopefully lead to this openness to one another and maybe help with, I mean, I never was thinking about it with like as being a therapist or trauma or anything when I was teaching, but it did seem to open, that openness happens.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your really interesting and open contribution to this discussion, to this exploration, I think Susan called it. And it's been a fascinating evening. I absolutely concur with what people have said about the clarity and the coherence of the presentation was really exceptional, Susan. So thank you so much. I just want to say that 10 minutes ago, I got a notification flashing across my screen from a Buddhist discussion group I'm part of. And the question was, can you change your subconscious reactions to trauma? So clearly, either it was just a serendipity moment, or else actually this subject is really in the ether now, and it's really important that we're talking about it, that we've got the opportunity, thanks to Susan, to incorporate it in our understanding of what we do in the dojo, in Koiko, with our students, or with our instructor, with our teachers. And I feel my practice has been deeply enriched by listening to Susan and working with her on this talk. And I'm hearing that from everybody else. So just finally, I'd like to say with everybody, thank you so much, Susan, for giving us a fascinating and very, very valuable evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.